Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jamie Fisher, and I am a professor at UC Davis in German and Cinema and Digital Media, and I'm the director of the UC Humanities Research Institute, UCHRI, which is located in Irvine, but is responsible for coordinating research around the whole UC system. And today's program, entitled Sustenance Conversations on Hunger, is a good example of that kind of cross-campus collaboration dialogue that we try to foster. We'll have professors from UC Davis and from UC Riverside. So I'll introduce them in a second. The sustenance conversations concern our annual theme. Each year, UCHRI, in concert with the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes from the UC, as well as the broader UC Humanities Network, chooses an annual theme. And the annual theme this year is sustenance, which we take in both its kind of literal and metaphorical or allegorical meanings. And as you'll hear from Professor Simmons today and Professor Biltikoff, I think we'll engage both of those registers of meaning today for the annual theme of sustenance. So I think our format will be that I will introduce both Professors Simmons and Biltikoff. I guess I'll introduce Professor Simmons first. I think she's going to go first in presenting. And then Professor Biltikoff will come back on and engage in a dialogue. Professor Biltikoff is an expert also in food studies like Professor Simmons, and we'll engage Professor Simmons in Q&A, and then we'll have a more open Q&A at the end, toward the end of the session. So Dana Simmons is chair and associate professor in the new Department of Society, Environment, and Health Equity at UC Riverside, where she researches and teaches the history of food, science, medicine, and public health. Her work examines how politics is scientized and how science is weaponized in the service of class, racial, and gendered violence. Her most recent book, which we'll be discussing here today, is On Hunger, Violence and Craving in America from Starvation to Ozempic, from UC Press, and is open access. Congratulations on the book, Professor Simmons. She'll be in dialogue today with Professor Charlotte Biltikoff, who's Professor of American Studies, Professor of Food Science and Technology, and Daryl Corti, Endowed Professor in Food, Wine, and Culture at the University of California, Davis. Her research, teaching, and service builds bridges between scientific and cultural approaches to questions about food and health. She is author of Real Food, Real Facts, Processed Food and the Politics of Knowledge from 2024, and Eating Right in America, The Cultural Politics of Food and Health from 2014. She's co-host of season 6 of Esculent, engaging food scientists in cultural conversations about edibility, and was previously a co-PI on the UC After Project, a multidisciplinary NSF-funded research project examining the Bay Area agri-food tech sector. Professor Biltikoff has published her work in academic journals that span a wide range of disciplinary and interdisciplinary terrain and teaches classes on food and culture at UC Davis. So I think we're going to open with a presentation by Professor Simmons about her exciting new book, and then Professor Biltikoff will come on and engage her in a dialogue about that, if I've understood correctly. So thank you both for being here, and everybody for being here.
Thank you so much to UCHRI and to Jamie and to Brittany Turner for your invitation and your support for this event. I'm super excited to be here, and I am super excited about the conversation that will happen in just a few minutes. But to frame the conversation, we thought that I might talk a little bit about the book just to give a kind of overview and lay out some topics initially for us to draw on in conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you all see that? Thanks. So this book came out of, I'm really happy to be speaking about this book in the context of UC because it really came out of a very specific University of California context, which is collaboration with the UCR Basic Needs Working Group roughly between 2016 and 2020 on student food insecurity. And that was really the moment when food insecurity on college campuses began to emerge as an issue of concern, and in particular at UC. And then also bookended, the writing of this book was really influenced by the 2022 graduate employee strike and conversations about starvation wages with graduate students. I want to show this is a flyer from graduate student during the graduate student strike of 2022. On one of the days of the strike, strikers occupied dining halls and um, blocked the cash machines and opened them up and invited students and others to come and eat for free. And this is an illustration from that moment, but also I think really encapsulates the approach and the argument that I took to writing this book. And just to sort of check in about that initial impetus for writing the book, food insecurity at UC is getting much worse quite quickly. So even since the book was published last year, undergraduate food insecurity has increased by almost 20% over the past 5 years. And that growth is really specifically in the numbers of undergraduate students with very low food insecurity, meaning that these are students who skip meals for financial reasons, who reduce the actual amount of food that they eat or the number of meals that they eat because they do not have enough money to buy food. Nearly half of undergraduate students across the University of California system are food insecure as of 2024, and that's a significant increase. And then likewise, if you look at graduate students, graduate levels of food insecurity among graduate students has increased to 30% in 2025. And that parallels an increase in household food insecurity across the United States, which over the same period of time from 2020 to roughly 2024 went up from 10.5% to 13.7%. Unfortunately, we won't know what happens after this, after 2024, because the current federal administration has canceled the USDA food insecurity, household food insecurity annual survey. But I did want to shout out my home campus, UC Riverside, and to show that the trend is very strong there. And then also, I don't know if anyone here is from UC Santa Cruz, but I don't know what is going on at UC Santa Cruz, but something really, really extreme is happening there. Santa Cruz used to be among the campuses that had the lowest level of food insecurity. It now has the highest level across the system. So I just wanted to show you all that because I was really, really surprised to see it. And I should actually clarify that I give you the color coding. The light yellow is very low food insecurity. In other words, students who are skipping meals because they can't afford to buy food. The gold is low food insecurity, which represents a state where the quality of food goes down for financial reasons. And then the blue represents food security. So just to go back to the all campus, the 2024 stat. So almost a third of UC students now are very food insecure, which is really a striking statistic. So drawing from that experience, I sort of decided, okay, I'm going to take the tools that I have, which is I come from a background in history, and particularly history of technology, history of science, history of medicine, and so began to look at the history of hunger. And the main argument that I make in my book is that hunger is a technology. In other words, hunger is produced. It's not a natural effect of scarcity or a struggle for existence. It's not a leftover from some pre-modern way of life. Sometimes people talk about hunger as, you may have heard of like the thrifty gene, where some people, the theory that some people have somehow genetically inherited this ancient kind of, that back in the early days, hunger served the role of a survival mechanism. I want to say that hunger is not just that. And it's not mainly that. It's not a natural state. And it's not the effect of individual bad luck or bad choices. Um, it is produced. So that's what I mean by hunger is a technology. Hunger is produced on purpose to get people or animals to do specific things. Um, and what do I mean by that? In terms of what do I mean by hunger as a technology? Technologies align material realities with ideas about how the world should be. That's a sort of general definition of a technology. And I want to argue that hunger functions in that way. Technologies are designed to be reproduced. Um, technologies in Ruha Benjamin's words, writing about carceral technologies, she says it feels like a default setting. Hunger feels like a default setting. It's something that's just there, powerfully reproducing hierarchies of power in ways that you might not even notice. Um, and hunger is a technology because it's used as a policy to get things done. So here's a table of contents of the book that describes different kinds of episodes where it becomes really visible in American history over the course of the 20th century that hunger is produced on purpose, that hunger is used as a technology. Um, I talk about how hunger is used as a method or a motivator. So in laboratories, scientists deprive rats and mice of food to get them to perform certain tasks. So this still is actually a film still from a 1948 film that was meant to teach students about motivation. And you had two rats on either side of a cage. One, as you can see, is labeled very hungry, and the other is labeled not hungry. And the educational film describes how the very hungry mouse is super motivated and is exploring everywhere and is very active and learns more quickly to press a lever to get food than the animal on the right that is not hungry, that has eaten its fill. And one of the arguments of my book is that hunger has been used and is produced to motivate people to do things. That's true in laboratories, in psychology experiments. That's true in prisons, in carceral spaces. And it's also true more generally that anti-welfare politicians warn that welfare and food aid might reduce people's motivation to work. So in other words, hunger is understood as a form of behavior control that motivates people to go to work and do work. And that almost seems like a natural law that, you have to make someone hungry to work. You may have heard this even in popular culture, to make someone hungry. Are you hungry? Are you, meaning, are you motivated? Are you working hard? In other contexts, hunger is used to displace people, as a weapon. To punish people, to control people. And I look at how this happens in the early 20th century, the late 19th century and early 20th century on Indian agencies in the United States, where the US government purposefully withheld rations, starved indigenous people in order to persuade them or to force them to sell their lands, to move off of lands, to change their subsistence, to establish agriculture, individual agriculture, as opposed to a more mobile hunting and gathering lifestyle. And that this was very explicit. So I find, records of Indian agents writing reports saying we are withdrawing rations from people to force them to do this. And one Indian agent called this the starving process. This kind of use of hunger as a technology to displace, to punish, to control is most visible currently in places like Gaza and Sudan, where thousands of people are purposefully deprived of food to make them leave. Um, and in prisons, in carceral spaces, food is used as a weapon to control incarcerated people's behavior. And then also, food is a technology because it's used as a policy. So hunger is explicitly created as a policy to make people buy things. So food companies design food in order to encourage people to purchase food and to increase their consumption. Um, Welfare rules and labor control are also forms of uses of hunger as a technology that are used when food is withdrawn from people to force them to do work, to force them to earn money. And each chapter in this book describes a particular way that hunger is deployed to a specific effect. So I mentioned some examples from the book. This book also looks at the way in which, at particular moments in history, groups of people have banded together and under a shared understanding that they are being made hungry. So one of my favorite things that I've researched for this book was movements like the Hunger Marchers during the Great Depression. This is an image from a meeting in Washington, D.C. before the big National Hunger March of 1930. And you can see in the back there, one of the marchers is holding a sign that says "Fight or Starve." And this was really a theme of the hunger marches during the Great Depression. And these movements brought together immigrants, women, people of color, and were led often by women, by Black women, by people of color. And brought together sharecroppers from the American South, miners in Kentucky, urban housewives, immigrant housewives in large cities like Chicago and New York, all of whom identified with the state of being made hungry. In other words, both the government and employers making decisions that meant that they did not have enough to eat. And they got together around this identity of being made hungry and held mass marches and campaigned at welfare offices for greater support and for decent meal. Likewise, in the 1960s, here's another version of the Fight or Starve campaign from the Great Depression. In the 1960s, the Pork Peoples Campaign brought together people similarly across ethnic identities, across including immigrants, around a common identity of being made hungry. And this is actually a small part of a mural that was part of the Resurrection City occupation of Washington, D.C. during the Poor People's Campaign of 1968, when caravans of people from across the country converged on Washington, D.C. To bring attention to poverty and to demand more control over their lives, more resources, and investment in poor communities. And the centerpiece of that campaign was this mural, The Hunger's Wall, which, and the message of the wall was, brothers and sisters, hunger is real. So my work both shows how hunger is mobilized as the technology to control people, to eliminate people, to to control labor, but then also stories of collectives of people who resisted being made hungry, Native people who refused to be blackmailed by hunger, incarcerated people who turned state violence against themselves into hunger strikes, the hunger marches, and the Poor People's Campaign. And at the end of my book, I touch on groups who are fighting logics, continuing to fight the kinds of logics of elimination, debt and labor control, and behavior control that are still operating today. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation now with Charlotte Biltikoff to think about how the kinds of issues that I write about that were prevalent in the 20th century are continue to play out today in the 21st century with the evisceration of food aid, global food aid, of SNAP benefits, of food benefits within the United States, and the ways in which hunger continues to be central to a politics of biological domination. So I'll stop there so that we can have a conversation. We have lots of time for conversation.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you for that great summary to give us a launching point for our conversation. And thank you for writing this book. I'm not sure I have had a chance to say to you how much I value the contribution you've made to our language, our way of thinking about and talking about hunger. This was really a much needed intervention, and unfortunately more timely than I think we even realized, right when you were finishing it up. Yeah. Um, so the first sort of direction I want to take us in builds right on where you just were in the images that you were showing us about that really illustrate hunger as a politics of the poor, to use your language, or as standing in for the politics of a poor for a politics of the poor, a public claim on collective commons, justifying demands for economic justice, etc. Because in addition to showing that those movements and collectivities, you also show throughout the book so many ways in which this politics was contested or reframed, or to use other language, rendered technical and otherwise diffused, right, by experts, scientific experts, policymakers, etc. I'm just going to throw out one example for those who haven't read the book. In the civil rights, Dana talks about how white in the civil rights era, um, white power structures across cotton growing regions undertook what she calls a near genocidal campaign of deprivation, basically colluding between plantation owners and county welfare boards to starve Black residents out of the South. And yet, poverty discourse in the 1960s figures poor people, especially Black people, as deficient, as somehow responsible for their own hunger. And you talk about how as soon as hunger starts and starvation start to be known in the public consciousness, experts step in to question the very nature of like hunger as a diagnosis, or there was in your mural, it said hunger is real. And that claim is actually being made against arguments that hunger isn't real. So can you say more about those dynamics? Thank you.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Yeah, I mean, the hunger is fascinating because we all know it, we all feel it, and we think that we can identify it, but it also is very difficult to actually define. And the definition itself is subject to incredible contestation and politics. And um, part of what I love, one of the things that you mentioned in your book, Charlotte, which I really love, is how food scientists and producers perpetuate an anti-politics machine, sort of repurposing a phrase by James Ferguson, anthropologist James Ferguson, where you take political questions like land and resources and jobs and wages, and you convert them into technical problems. And hunger is such an interesting case for that, because um, you have at the same time, and not coincidentally, not coincidentally, at the same time, you have these groups of people who are beginning to politicize around hunger. So at these two moments in particular, during the Great Depression and then again in the 1960s, where you have these mass mobilizations nationwide of people which are also really interesting social mobilizations because they very specifically cross gender, ethnic, and regional divides. At the same time that that starts to happen is when there becomes a sort of like I don't want to say technocratic, but almost like a panic, an expert panic, and a political panic around containing what is hunger. Um, in particular, reducing its scope. So they're always in during the 30s and again in the 60s and again in the 80s and again, today in the 2000s and 2020s, you see people who are trying to contain to say, well, hunger is not a technical term. We can't measure it. How can we even say that there are hungry people when we can't measure them? We can't observe them. We can't. We know that we can talk about things like deficiencies, vitamin deficiencies, but hunger, on the other hand, is just a feeling. Um, so. Um, I think that's like a through line all the way through. And there's a really fantastic moment, which I barely touch on in the book, which is really interesting in the 1980s, in particular, where Ronald Reagan and Ed Meese, Ronald Reagan's one of his chief sort of staff members, say, well, there's no hunger in America, or there's very little hunger in America, and anyway, we can't even know how much there is. All these claims that hunger is increasing are ridiculous. We have no idea what it means. And that's actually where the idea of food insecurity comes out of. Because an anthropologist at Cornell, Kathy Radimer, said, okay, let's find a way to measure. That's different than the way that nutritionists measure deficiencies. And she went out and did like a deep ethnography that grounded the questions that are asked on, or that were asked before it was canceled, were asked on the USDA Household Food Security Survey. Yeah, so thinking about the ways that even just the statement, there is hunger, is deeply, deeply, deeply contested and continues to be contested.
Yeah, and you mentioned that even nutrition experts like kind of historically kind of stayed out of the hunger conversation. And I've seen this at other points where there's this tension within nutrition and nutrition education around like whether the field what counts as being too political for nutrition, whether that's thinking about the environment in relationship to eating habits, the connection between individual eating habits and the well-being of others in the food system. I'm familiar with that history, but what you've showed me is that there's also a history where nutrition experts themselves have claimed that their realm is purely technical and sort of somehow cut off an area of expertise around food in the body that doesn't include hunger. Is that how you understand it?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think, in some ways, I see some of those moves as just really strategic and political. I mean, there are some figures who are just very transparent, in their desire. So particularly in the 60s when there was a kind of popular, I mean, in fact, historians have described this as like the discovery of hunger in the United States, as if, one needed that's a very fraught framing because who's doing the discovering and who already knew. Um, but during that period, you really see experts, like there are a few who just very explicitly are saying things like, well, these symptoms that are being described as deficiencies, it might just come from drinking too much milk or, being exposed to parasites. It's like the tobacco strategy, right? Like, oh, there are many, many different explanations, and therefore we can't definitively say that hunger is one of them. But I mean, I think nutrition experts in the 60s, of all people, they might have been the ones who discover that there's hunger. Ironically, I think that there was very much this kind of focus on vitamin deficiencies through the early 20th century, as you write about in your own work, that, and then the sense that, well, we've resolved the problem through supplements. And then a kind of, I guess, almost like a professional lack of tools to be able to
Mm.
grapple with systemic and political um, technologies like those like welfare and labor control that are systemically producing hunger.
Yeah. Um, okay. I try to like figure out where to go next. I have so many questions for you, but I just want to add one piece to this conversation before we move on to talk a little bit more about food policy and regulation today. Um, It seems to me that another really important through line in food politics and in the history and politics of hunger that you've laid out is this idea of personal responsibility. So just to add on to the conversation we're already having about how pervasive this idea is. And again, for those who haven't read the book, it is so pervasive that even in this context of well-designed hunger in the carceral system, as you describe it, I just think this is such a powerful, overwhelming example of how pervasive ideologies of personal responsibility can be when it comes to food and health. Tell us how this manifests in the carceral environment.
Yeah, so jails and prisons in the United States use hunger very explicitly as technologies of behavior control. So, both in the ways that they schedule meals, so incarcerated people will often be exposed to unpredictable meal times and sometimes that are squished together so that, you might have breakfast at 6 a.m. and then lunch at 3 and dinner at 4. And the way that meal times are compressed. So there's a temporal dimension to this. And then also in the content of food itself, the ways in which incarcerated spaces, save money by providing the lowest possible amount of food, but then also as a technique of punishment. There's something called the neutral loaf, which you all may have heard of which is sort of like a loaf of leftovers, peels, meat renderings, fats, that it's just squished together, cooked, and then served cold in a paper bag. It's disgusting. It's incredibly thick, heavy, but it fulfills the Supreme Court requirements for basic nutritional calories and vitamins. So in that context, there are programs to help prisoners make better food choices, um, which is just kind of mind-blowing, like to help because a lot of incarcerated people are suffering from diabetes, have metabolic disease that are exacerbated by the content and also the context in which they're eating. Um, and even within that context, you see some sort of like motivational programming in some spaces to, like train incarcerated people to make good food choices and eat fresh food and vegetables. So, I mean, that's in some ways almost like the most ironic and ridiculous of all of these kinds of programs, but that maybe just demonstrates like the contradiction between the structural and and an ideology of individual responsibility.
Yeah. The confluence of this powerful ideology of personal responsibility in the carceral state sort of, yeah, produced this moment. What did you call it? Not ridiculous. You had a word. Just the bizarreness of these
Yeah.
programs. It really says a lot, actually. Um, so thank you for that. I want to take you now into the part of your book you haven't really said too much about yet that really thinks at this intersection of hunger and processed food and food policy and regulation. And now you know we're really getting into like some juicy territory that I'm excited about also. So one of the things that you talk about that you haven't mentioned is how in the mid-century there's this research around neural signals that drive hunger, not the need state of hunger, but the desire for pleasure. I think we could call it craving also. And
Mhm.
the research is done because military rations aren't getting eaten, and scientists want to understand the senses. This is where we get sensory sciences. And those findings are also taken up by the food industry to shape formulation and marketing. And at the same time, they start to raise serious questions, right? Concerns about whether food advertising, branding, marketing, et cetera, could like take over the brain through these mechanisms of desire that have just been unveiled. And so there's these strong calls in the 1960s for government regulation on what you refer to as producers' access to consumers' minds. I love that. Um, can you tell us a little bit about the actions that were taken by regulators at that time? And then you wrote about in the moment you wrote that, you said this seems impossible today. So I'm curious. I want the arc of this conversation to be, what they were forced to do, um, how they came to seem impossible, and then do they seem possible again? So that's kind of the direction. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. Yeah, so I actually I should have mentioned, and I had a little picture of a Snickers bar advertisement that I forgot to show you all. You know the Snickers ad that you're not you when you're hungry, um, which I think really encapsulates in some ways the ways in which food producers since the 40s, as you mentioned, have been studying the science of the body and of hunger for a very specific reason, which is to design foods that provoke that craving. Um, and they're very explicit about it. Sugar is probably it's the easy target, but it's also one of the most interesting in looking at that history because I was really surprised. I had no idea this existed before doing this research. But sugar, starting in the 50s and actually all the way through the 60s, this was a really long campaign, had an advertising campaign that communicated to people that if you wanted to control your appetite, you should take a spoonful of sugar. That was, and they actually, cited wrongly and weirdly a bunch of research about the relationship between blood sugar and hunger. Um, and in the 60s, the Federal Trade Commission actually intervened and forced the Sugar Research Association, which was the Sugar Producers Association that was funding this very long series of advertisements, to publish a retraction. So in all of these magazines, like Red Book and Women's Wear Daily and like Sunset and all of these sort of consumer magazines where they had been publishing these ads, they had to publish an ad that said, "Well, we weren't telling you the truth," basically. Although it's really interesting the way that they ended up doing it was is also, I think, really revelatory. So they were forced by the Federal Trade Commission to, and in some ways, like the logic of the Federal Trade Commission was that we had to step in and actually stop food producers from manipulating people, which I think that's the part that seems bizarre today and that seems just really hard to reach. And of course, when they did it, they published a picture of this like huge ice cream sundae and saying like, "Oh, dieting is hard. We hope you didn't get the message that, we thought that it would be easy to diet." But sugar is a wonderful food and it gives you pleasure. Like that was actually the agreement that they came to with the Federal Trade Commission was that they weren't allowed to say that sugar would help you to lose weight or to lose your appetite, but they were allowed to talk about the positive qualities of sugar. And so that's where you get like, oh, isn't it delicious? That kind of like arc of putting the emphasis on pleasure it comes out of that too. But yeah, I mean, I think the thing that seems so hard to conceive is that actually, like at the White House Conference on Nutrition, and this was Nixon, it's not like super progressive person. Um, at that conference, it was very seriously discussed how, the state needs to intervene because food companies were manipulating people into buying things that weren't good for them. And that this was a national problem that required, regulatory solutions. That I think is just really hard to conceive of as a discussion. I mean, today, not even as in today since the last election, but just generally.
Yes, and yet we're closer to that moment right now than we've been at any time since then, I would argue. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that is a super interesting thing too, because it's not for the same reason.
Right.
Yeah, and I know, I mean that's something we've talked about before, and we're just trying to figure out like what is going on with this right
Yeah.
now? Like what turn are we taking right now with MAHA and food interventions?
Yeah, I want to take you there a little bit. I think, the MAHA food policy and the new dietary guidelines and all of this, it gets a lot of attention, but I think it's really important to also acknowledge some of the other policy changes and to get your perspective on them. So, for example, I wanted you to start out by seeing if you can help us understand the new work requirements for SNAP through the lens of your research and the history that you know. How can we, yeah, what is your perspective on this and why it's happening and maybe how we resist that?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I mean, there are two things I think, and I'm
Oh,
still
we should
grappling.
probably say what SNAP is for
Oh
anybody
yeah,
who's
right.
joining
Thank
this.
you. Yes. So SNAP is the Supplemental Nutrition Program, otherwise known as food stamps. Um, it Recently, the Congress, so in the big beautiful bill, HR 1 last fall, imposed work requirements. In other words, anybody receiving food benefits, also health care, so Medicaid, for example, will have to demonstrate, unless they're shown to be disabled, chronically disabled, they will have to demonstrate that they work at least 80 hours a month. So that's a huge paperwork burden, if nothing else, and is actually designed and calculated to reduce the number of people. I mean, it's almost mechanical when you put a really challenging a barrier of documentation to accessing benefits, the number of people who access those benefits will go down. So that's clearly one thing that's going on. But I think there are a couple of really powerful ideologies at play as well that are not new, but that are particularly influential at this moment. And the first of those is eugenics. I think we may tend to lose sight of how powerful and how prevalent eugenic thought is at this moment. I mean, it's always there as an undercurrent, but it is so explicit and in so many domains that I almost feel like people forget to talk about that. And what I mean by that is, when I say eugenic thought, what I mean by that is the assumption, first of all, the assumption that there are inherited genetic differences that make certain groups of people inferior or superior, and the desire to eliminate quote unquote defective or inferior people. And this has, I mean, you can see this everywhere, like looks maxing. I think it, is it's not by accident that there's this kind of conglomeration of things having to do with body measurement, with body perfection, um, with um, reproduction, that increase, trying to encourage people, particularly, white people, to have lots of children. Um, that's a kind of a cluster of thought that goes along with the punitive side, or the negative eugenic side of elimination. And I think it's you can't understand, for example, why there was so much attention to food aid and USAID early on in the Trump administration, like the very first thing, for both Trump and for Elon Musk. I mean, both of them are well documented, to be invested in eugenic ideas. Um, so thinking about the ways in which, and there's a long history of eugenic ideology, that connects up food aid in particular, feeding people, as a menace to the eugenic project. Because if you're feeding someone who's inferior or defective, right, you're perpetuating their life, their ability to reproduce, and that, for people who want to, for eugenicists, that goes against their project. And so I really think that that's one piece of ideology which is really critical in thinking through what's happening in terms of food policy and more broadly. And then the other ideology, which is still, like, similarly has always been around, but is really kind of coming to the fore at the moment, is it comes out of utilitarian thought, which is basically sort of this idea that that people only do things in response to pleasure or pain signals. This seems almost obvious to us because it really has been kind of naturalized by psychology, and that's part of the story I tell in the book. But this idea that what this gets translated in the policy realm to this idea that you have to make people hungry or else they're not going to work, that hunger pushes people to work. And you can see this, there's this famous, like, well, and they don't say this very explicitly very often, but Mike Johnson did let this slip at some point, like, well, food aid and Medicaid are not for a 29-year-old man sitting on the couch, at home, his parents' house playing video games. In other words, like, we have to cut this off because if we don't, then someone will rather sit there and play video games instead of doing productive work. And of course, we know that's BS. We know that work requirements are going to hit middle-aged people, chronically ill people the hardest. So I think those are two things I would love to know. I mean, yeah, I'm curious to know what you think about any of that, like the current configuration too.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I absolutely think you're right that the conversation about eugenics is really important. I think you probably know this, but the progressive era dietary reformers talked about in the like eugenic era when it was very explicit and a massive social movement, developed a movement for euthenics, which was about teaching people how to eat right, and which they described as eugenics for the present. Eugenics is for future generations. Euthenics, which is changing the environment in the present, is for now. Um, and they claimed that proudly. So I want so I want to talk a little bit more. It's a little bit more about SNAP, and it's also about a question about processed food. So You talk, for example, you came up, I think this is your language about nutritis. You talk about the Nutriloaf, for example, which you've already described as nutritis, nutritional detritus, right? And elsewhere in the book, you also described processed food, which just to update that, I think we would use the language of ultra processed food now to describe what you meant then. Our language around this is changing. You describe ultra processed food as detritus as well. And so this is tricky. There's also, right, all these, the USDA passed a new waiver so that states could apply for new SNAP restrictions, restricting what they consider processed and unhealthy foods for SNAP purchases. Not, this is obviously not obviously. This has thrown grocery stores, shoppers, SNAP recipients into utter chaos across all these states, and I haven't counted them, but a lot that have enacted these restrictions on soda, energy drinks, candy, prepared desserts. And I just wanted to get your perspective on this because I know that some people in public health are actually very positive about SNAP restrictions. And yet I also very much see these SNAP restrictions as in the kind of punitive eugenics mode of this administration. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is so complicated. So many of these policies, especially the Maha policies, are things that are like adjacent to things that seem like a good idea, which makes them really hard to parse. Because you're like, well, yes, who wants red food dyes? Like maybe that's okay. And I've seen lots of commentators being like, oh, well, this particular thing, yes, it might be okay. I mean, certainly, like in an ideal world, you're encouraging people to buy healthy food and you're giving them means to do that. And that's the adjacent part. But then, of course, why are you applying restrictions on what people can buy only to SNAP recipients when we know that SNAP people who receive food aid don't eat any better or worse than people who do not receive food aid? So this is not the targeting is doing some work that's not just a public health work. And that I think is what you're referencing, that it's punitive. I mean, that's, clearly the case. Um, so yeah, I think there's that. And then oh right, I think, the other thing that I keep thinking about is the way in which health and healthiness are being mobilized, obviously make America healthy again. Um, But the way in which that, I think in some ways these restrictions also serve as a sort of distractor. Um, I mean, I found it totally wild, relatedly, that when you read the Maha report on, on child health, um, they go through this long analysis, long list of things that threaten children's health, like the dyes, the synthetic food, the pesticides, um, all of these things. And their one policy recommendation is to reduce the money for school lunches. It's like that's the adjacent, like, okay, I'm following you on pesticides, but what? You want to, and then your solution to this is to
Yeah.
reduce the money for school lunches. It's the same kind of process, I feel like, happening with SNAP. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, and I was just going to say one of the most glaring absences in the conversation within and also around Maha, I would say, is that hunger is not talked about. There's all this building of momentum and, Maha moms and movement, social movement, rhetoric and action, and now all this power to make policy through these cabinet positions around solving problems for food and health while hunger is just being manufactured alongside that same machine. And it's yeah, I think it's really important to that's your role, right? Is to always bring hunger back into the conversation to make sure that we have the right language and concepts for thinking about that in this context. I think it's extremely important. Um, I don't know if you have the numbers, but just like the change in the new work requirements and the way in which people were thrown off of their benefits during the government shutdown and the difficulties of getting people back on, I think that the numbers are just way reduced, not to mention rising healthcare costs, all this production of poverty, production of hunger alongside like, yeah, getting the red dye out. And it's,
Yeah, can I say something about that
please.
too? Because I see that there are some students from my class here, and thank you for coming. And one of the things that we have been talking about is access to healthcare and the impact of cost. And we read a piece about how a third of U.S. adults say they skipped or postponed healthcare in the last year because of cost. 20% have not filled a prescription because of cost, and 40% have medical debt. And I think that's so. I think it's the sort of thing you kind of know, but then it floats in the background and maybe isn't as it doesn't appear front and center, but I do think it's that those statistics are actually incredibly important for thinking through what all of these recommendations, reports, discourses around food and choices in eating, part of what they're doing. Because the background to that is that so many people are not able to access basic health care, are not able to actually care for disease with medical means. And I think that just helps like to then understand what the role, say, of supplements ends up becoming. Um, where this sort of there are these fissures, right, that are opening and things are flowing into them. Replacements are or ideas are flowing into these absences to fill them.
Yeah, thank you. I do want to open it up for questions.